This is video from the can because I am out of town right now. Have you ever been in an argument with someone and they just sort of started making claims that you knew were factually untrue? Let's face it, you probably have. Sometimes these people will even provide sources for their outrageous claims. The thing is, very rarely will these sources actually support their hypothesis. They will, however, tend to be very long articles of some news site, maybe like a blog that pretends to be a news site, or a blog that pretends to be a university. And on occasion, you might also find a scientific article. And though their source does not support what they are saying at all, often the exact opposite will be the case. They will proclaim victory anyway, and in the informal context of an internet or, God forbid, face-to-face conversation with a person, a lot of people around them will tend to agree. After all, they provided a source for what they said, so it must be true. To demonstrate that their source does not support their thesis, you would have to read it front to back and analyze it, which is par for the course in formal intellectual discourse, but once again, we find ourselves in an informal situation where that isn't always necessarily possible. If you're in a real-life argument, you're not going to sit down for 15 minutes and read articles on your phone. And if you're arguing on the internet, the bullshitter will most certainly make maximum use of the time that you spend reading their sources and loudly proclaim your silence as conceit. By the time you can demonstrate that the sources cited are bullshit and do not in fact support the initial argument at all, which might take some research on your part because debunking isn't always easy, the conversation will most likely have moved on already. And if you then come back with it, oh, you're a sore loser who just couldn't take it. But even assuming that it's still about the topic, there are a slew of problems that you can run into. You can explain to a bullshitter why their sources are bullshit, but they continue being the person with the most cards in their hand. They might claim that you just don't know what you're talking about, and if you did know what you're talking about, you would agree with them, and therefore they must be correct. They could just claim that you haven't read their source at all, and really, how are you gonna prove that you did? Most of the time, they themselves will not have read the source, because actually properly citing a source isn't really why they threw it at you in the first place. Or they might just straight up ignore the fact that you demonstrated that their source is bullshit and or does not support their argument at all, and just pretend like it did. But the best thing they can do is just throw another bullshit source at you, which you then have to get into and debunk. Which once again gives them the time to dance on your grave, while hoping that the conversation sort of tapers off or moves into a different direction while they were still having the upper hand. Because people like that do not care about having an actual discourse about a subject matter. They just want to loudly proclaim their point and then be right. Or rather, be seen as being right by the onlookers, which to them is basically the same thing as being right. People tend to think that they're right when others agree with them. It's just one of those human biases. And the problem is, if you engage with people like that on their terms, you will lose the argument every single time, even if you are factually correct by every metric imaginable, because they have the power of bullshit on their side. Make no mistake, in an informal discussion context, bullshit is the most powerful weapon that you can deploy. The core advantage of using bullshit instead of some actual proper standard of evidence is that you can always come up with more bullshit faster than whoever you are arguing against can debunk the bullshit that you have provided. And this works both on the offense and the defense. You might, for instance, provide a source that is actually scientifically valid and does actually support your thesis, and they can just say, well, that study's been debunked. And then that's the case. Anything bullshit says becomes truth, because bullshit does not play the game of science Bullshit plays the game of bullshit. This is why we do not hold scientific discussions that are supposed to be scientifically valid in an informal context, especially not in the presence of laymen. This is why we have the scientific method and why science takes so long to figure shit out. It's actually quite easy to sound smart to most people, especially if they're not experts on a given thing. And quick life pro tip, all people are not experts on the overwhelming majority of things on account of there being a lot of things. The parameters of such a conversation are not measured against factual truth or scientific veracity. They are, at the end of the day, nothing more than a social exercise. And if you start screeching autistically about how your opponent is using logical fallacies and how the scientific method actually works, well, if they have a little bit of social capital, they can very easily make you look like a little bitch. And this is not true in every context. It's a lot more difficult to deploy bullshit as a tactic when you are having a discussion in, a group of people who are trained in at least the basics of the scientific method and stuff. Which is why I think this should have a very high priority in school. The thing is, in 99.9% of cases, you will never, ever be able to convince the person you are arguing against that your position is correct, even if it is. They went into this discussion knowing that they are right, and that no new information could possibly change their knowledge of what is already factually correct. Most of the time, they won't even be trying to convince you. If you really want to insist upon the idea of winning an argument, which personally I think is not really like a good way of looking at it, but if you do want to insist on looking at it that way, then winning an argument is not when you convince your opponent, but when you convince the audience. Which, obviously not every argument has an audience, but if it does, you might get into a problematic situation if they're not scientifically literate and if your opponent is in the habit of deploying bullshit. A lot of people will tell you that it's just best to let bullshitters be, but I don't think it's that simple. Say you are in an argument online, some sort of public space, and the other person just keeps piling on the bullshit. People are watching this and may or may not be on the fence on this particular subject matter. You know that you are correct because of the evidence. And now it becomes your job to basically debunk all of the bullshit that the bullshitter throws at you. If you don't, you run the risk of having people which are not very scientifically literate and are sitting on the fence about this given subject matter falling for the bullshit because it sounds like it makes sense. But on the other side of that coin, because bullshit is bullshit, there is always more bullshit. However, if for the sake of your own mental sanity you stop arguing with this absolute moron, they will have the last word, and they will spin your silence as conceit because that is one of the core parts of their tactic. And though most of your audience will probably just sort of roll their eyes and look away at some point because this shit gets very exhausting even if you are an onlooker, some people, a small handful of the audience, might get the impression that it's actually the bullshit that is the truth. And while it is definitely better for your mental health to just let that shit go and do something that you actually enjoy doing instead of screaming at a wall while also banging your head on that wall and punching that wall with your fists until they run red with blood, that attitude is also why you get so many anti-vaxxers and Holocaust deniers and flat earthers. If you don't go around debunking the bullshit that the bullshit preachers preach, they will continue preaching their bullshit and convince people who have never heard the counter-arguments. They will find their echo chambers and people will come listen to them. These people will then never be confronted with the more rational and factual argument. And because they have never been provided with the counter-arguments, they will start believing the bullshit. So on one hand, in the name of truth and science it is your holy duty to debunk the bullshit. But on the other hand, it is a task you will never be finished with, because no matter how much bullshit you work hard to debunk, there will always be an infinite amount of bullshit left in the intellectual latrine of humanity. Plus, it's like really difficult to care about something and then see someone saying things that are not true about it, and then not respond to them to explain why those things are not true. I really get that impulse. So frankly, I can't tell you what to do because I myself do not have the answer. We have to fight bullshit, certainly, but we can't be so preoccupied with fighting bullshit that it interferes with our truth-seeking either. There's always a balance to be struck, and finding that balance can be more difficult than the incessant arguing itself. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Subscribestar or Patreon, or buying some of this beautiful, primo merchandise. And in that spirit, fucking look after yourself. It's real. I know it's difficult not to get bogged down in these fucking discussions, and I know it's like, it feels very important, but sometimes you have to dissociate. But also don't judge the people who do this. And see you around, cunts.